The old watch shop on the corner of Mariner Street was a place where time didn't just tick, it gathered dust. A single shaft of sunlight cut through the perpetual gloom, illuminating a million dancing motes of dust and casting a warm glow on the workbench. It was here, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten seconds, that Leo found his peace. His hands, scarred and steady, moved with the unhurried precision of a surgeon, disassembling a broken clock with a focus that bordered on the spiritual. Every tiny gear, every microscopic spring was a problem he could solve, a piece of a world he could control. But on the bench, separate from the others, sat a single stopped pocket watch. It wasn't just broken, it was a monument, a silent reminder of a moment frozen forever in his past. There are places where time isn't just measured, but felt. This was one of them. For the last decade, Leo had lived inside this quiet museum of moments, his only company, the rhythmic tick-tock of repaired clocks. He'd become an expert at fixing what was broken for strangers, meticulously piecing together their pasts. But he couldn't fix his own. His routine was his armor: open the shop, wipe the glass, sit at the bench, and disappear into the intricate dance of gears and springs. The world saw a man who worked with his hands, but no one saw the one thing he was really doing, running from a day that had changed everything, a day he could never get back. His pain wasn't a loud wail or an outward show of grief. It was the suffocating weight of silence. He avoided mirrors, not wanting to see the stranger staring back, the man who had walked away from the desert with a promise broken. His routine was an almost religious ritual, a way to keep the memories at bay. He'd stopped listening to the news, stopped answering calls from old numbers, and stopped going to the cemetery. His greatest fear wasn't death, it was being asked about what he had left behind. That morning, though, there was a knock at the door. Not the usual chime of a customer, but a soft, hesitant rap, a sound that was completely out of place in his world of mechanical precision. It was the sound of something he couldn't fix with a screwdriver. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. But that morning, a child's voice broke everything open. If you've ever lost something that felt like part of your soul, stay with this story. The knock echoed in the quiet air, a disruption that shook the very foundations of his carefully constructed peace. Leo didn't move at first, his gaze fixed on the broken pocket watch. He knew with a veteran's instinct that this was a moment of decision. To ignore it would be to maintain the fragile sanctuary he had built around himself, a sanctuary of isolation and buried grief. But something, a flicker of a long-extinguished curiosity, made him pause. The clock on the wall, one of the few with a clear, resonant chime, struck the hour, its sound feeling like a countdown. It was as if the universe itself was signaling that his time of quiet solitude was about to end, whether he was ready for it or not. The door opened slowly, not with the gust of wind he expected, but with a small, quiet presence. Standing there was a young girl, no older than 10, with eyes that held a wisdom far beyond her years. In her hand, she clutched a small, worn leather pouch. She didn't speak immediately. She just looked at him, her expression a mix of nervousness and fierce determination. Sashi's dust motes in the light seemed to swirl around her, like tiny, agitated dancers. In that moment, Leo's world, so carefully constructed from stillness and silence, began to fracture. The ticking clock suddenly felt louder, a chorus of witnesses to a change he had spent years trying to prevent. He wasn't always this silent. There was a time when Leo's laugh was loud and his words flowed freely, a time when life wasn't measured in the silent ticking of clocks, but in the camaraderie of the desert heat. The dust was a constant companion, but so was the easy banter, the shared jokes, and the unbreakable belief that they were invincible. The memories weren't clear films in his mind, but fragmented snapshots. The blinding sun, the taste of sand, and the faces of the men he fought alongside. In that world, a man's identity was defined by his loyalty, and every promise was a sacred pact, sealed not with words, but with shared hardship and a quiet understanding. Among them was Marcus. He wasn't just a friend, he was a brother. Marcus was the kind of man who carried a worn photograph of his daughter in his wallet and a quiet optimism in his eyes. He was the anchor, the one who kept everyone grounded in the reality of what they were fighting for. Before they left for the mission that would change everything, Marcus had given Leo something. It was an old pocket watch, a family heirloom. "My father gave me this," he'd said, his voice low. "It's seen a lot of time, and it's always come home, just like we will." The watch was more than just an object. It was a symbol, a beacon of home, and the future they were both certain they'd live to see. The weight of that promise, of that shared certainty, was a physical thing. "We'll come back together no matter what," they'd sworn, their voices lost to the wind. It was a simple yet profound vow, a comfort they both clung to in the face of chaos. It was the last thing Leo remembered hearing before the ambush. The day had started like any other, but it had ended in a storm of dust and noise, a violent rupture in the fabric of their reality. The pact, meant to be an unbreakable bond, became a chain that would forever shackle Leo to that moment, to the single second when everything fell apart and the world went silent. The chaos came without warning, a sudden, brutal symphony of sound and light. The roar of the explosion, the dust kicking up like a ghost, and the shouts of men were a blur. Time, the very thing Leo now obsessed over, seemed to shatter into a million fragments. He saw it all in a slow-motion nightmare. Marcus, a flash of movement, the ground rushing up to meet him. Leo didn't need to check for a pulse. He just knew. The world outside his vision ceased to exist. There was only the empty space where his friend had been, the chilling silence that followed the storm, and the overwhelming, suffocating weight of his own survival. He came home a different man, a shell of the person who had left. The homecoming was a blur of sympathetic faces and polite condolences that felt like a slap. He was called a hero, but all he heard was traitor. He had returned, but Marcus hadn't. That's all that mattered. The pocket watch, a relic of a past that seemed to belong to a different lifetime, had been found in the rubble and returned to him. He was meant to give it to Marcus's family, but he couldn't. The shame was too great. The watch became his burden, a physical representation of the promise he had broken. He put it away, buried it, and never spoke of it again. "Is this where you fix time?" a soft voice asked, pulling Leo from the suffocating depths of his memory. He looked up, his eyes readjusting to the dim light of the shop. Standing before him, the little girl from the door was holding out a small, worn leather pouch. Her eyes were wide and hopeful, a stark contrast to the despair that had settled over his soul. "My mom said you're the best there is, that you can make anything work again," she continued, her voice filled with an innocence that was almost painful to hear. It was a simple question, a child's plea, but it was also a direct challenge to the very foundation of his solitude. Slowly, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly, Leo took the pouch. He undid the clasp, and the world seemed to stop. Inside, nestled on a bed of old velvet, was the pocket watch. The same watch. Its brass casing was scratched and faded, the glass face cracked, and the hands were frozen at an impossible angle. It was the first time he had held it since that day. The cold metal felt like a brand against his skin, and the years of guilt and buried grief came rushing back, a physical wave of nausea. This isn't just a watch. It's the weight of his broken promise, the ghost of his friend, and the reason he had locked himself away from the world. "My dad he was a hero," she said, her voice soft but sure. "He told my mom that this watch, it was lucky, and it would always bring him home. But it didn't." Her voice cracked just a little, a small tear welling in her eye. She looked at him not with pity or judgment, but with a simple, honest pain. She saw a broken watch, not a broken man. She didn't understand the history, the pact, the betrayal Leo felt. She just wanted a piece of her father back, and in her innocent request, she was forcing Leo to confront the very thing he had spent a decade trying to outrun. Leo's first instinct was to say no, to close the pouch, to hand it back, and to retreat into the safe, sterile world of his shop, where the only broken things were gears and springs. He had no right to touch this. He had no right to fix something that was so profoundly connected to his own failure. He met her gaze, and for the first time in years, he saw Marcus's eyes staring back at him, not a ghost from the past, but the living, hopeful light of his legacy. He saw the same quiet strength, the same gentle soul. He couldn't turn her away. He couldn't refuse this small act of faith. He closed the pouch, his knuckles white, and nodded once. What would you do if the only way forward was through everything you'd buried? Keep watching. Because this moment became a battlefield. This choice, Leo sat hunched over the workbench, his magnifying loupe pressed against his eye, his breath a silent cloud in the cool air. This wasn't a repair job. It was an excavation. With every tiny screw he loosened and every microscopic gear he cleaned, he was peeling back layers of a past he'd meticulously buried. His hands, usually so steady, trembled with the effort, not from the work itself, but from the emotional weight of each movement. He was trying to untangle not just a broken mechanism, but the tangled mess of his own memories, the precise chaos of a moment that had forever stopped his own internal clock. The first trigger was a small crescent-shaped scratch on the watch casing. It was a scar he'd never noticed before. The image of it brought a memory to the surface, a joke Marcus had cracked just before they left the truck, a shared look, a moment of pure, unadulterated normalcy. The irony was a physical blow. That tiny, unremarkable imperfection on the watch face was a window into a past that was so vibrant, so alive, that it made his present silence feel even more suffocating. It was a ghost of a smile, a phantom laugh, a brutal reminder that the man he had once been was just as broken as the watch in front of him. As he continued to work, his tweezers plucked a single, impossibly fine piece of grit from the gears. He held it up to the light. It wasn't just a piece of dust. It was a grain of sand, the same kind that had blown across the desert floor that day. It was a tangible link to a place he had promised himself he would never revisit, a physical remnant of the tragedy. He could almost smell the arid air, feel the blistering sun on his face, hear the silence that came after the storm. The sand, a tiny, innocuous particle, was now a boulder of guilt in his hands, a physical manifestation of the reality he had spent years trying to pretend didn't exist. Maya returned a few days later, a small, bright spot, in the muted colors of the shop. She didn't ask about the watch. She simply placed a small, smooth, white rock on the corner of his workbench. "My mum says these are lucky," she said, her voice a little girl whisper. "She says if you give someone a piece of the ocean, it helps them remember how big the world is." It was such a small, earnest gesture, so utterly removed from the transactional nature of his business. This small piece of the outside world, a simple rock from the beach, felt like an accusation and a gift all at once. The narrator paused, watching the scene unfold with a quiet reverence. Maya wasn't a customer. She was a catalyst. Her innocence was a blinding light, forcing Leo to see the truth of his own darkness. She didn't understand the complex web of guilt and trauma. She only saw a man who seemed sad, and she instinctively tried to help in the only way she knew how, with an offering of comfort. She was the living, breathing embodiment of what Marcus had left behind, a gentle presence that held up a mirror to a man who had been running from his reflection for a decade. As Leo returned to the watch, he turned the casing over in his hand, his gaze drawn to an almost invisible etching on the inside. He had to use his loupe to see it clearly. His breath hitched. It was a message, written in Marcus's familiar, hurried scrawl, a series of coordinates and a date. Leo's mind reeled back to the last conversation they had. Marcus had pulled out a map, his finger tracing a different route, a different objective. He had a plan, a personal mission he'd kept to himself. The coordinates were for a location they were never supposed to be. The revelation was a brutal blow. Leo now understood why Marcus was carrying a sealed envelope with a note addressed to his wife. A note with those coordinates. Marcus was going to split off from the group. He'd planned to go to a specific location to retrieve a small cache of supplies he'd placed there weeks before. But Leo, wanting to keep his brother close, had insisted they stick to the main group. They'd compromised, taking a route that was supposed to be a little safer, a route that would keep them together. But that was the route that led them directly into the ambush. The memory now played with a devastating clarity. The argument, the push and pull of their wills, the final compromise. It wasn't just a matter of survival. It was a choice he had influenced, a decision that had cost Marcus his life. The shame he'd carried was a shield against the truth, that the promise wasn't just broken, it had been an impossible one from the start. He wasn't just guilty of surviving, he was guilty of making the choice that led his friend to a path he wasn't supposed to take. The ethical burden was immense, a new layer of grief that was even heavier than the last. Maya came in again that afternoon. She saw the turmoil on his face, but she didn't say a word. She simply sat on a small wooden stool, her knees drawn up to her chest, and began to draw in a small notebook. Her presence was a silent anchor, a beacon of simple humanity in the storm of his internal world. She was the one person who, without a single word, was giving him permission to feel the unbearable weight of his emotions. She didn't need him to be a hero, she just needed him to be there, and in that she was giving him the gift of quiet permission to exist. Leo tried to continue the work, but his hands, so precise just moments before, now shook uncontrollably. The tiny gears slipped from his tweezers, falling onto the bench with a sound like broken glass. He couldn't do it. He was an expert at fixing what was broken, but he couldn't fix this. He could put the watch back together, but it would always be a lie. It would be a monument to a promise he didn't just break, but one he had influenced to become an impossibility. He sat back, his head in his hands, defeated not by the mechanism, but by the weight of the truth he had unearthed. The silence was broken by the gentle scrape of wood on the floor. Maya had walked over to the bench. She didn't try to touch the watch. Instead, she picked up one of the small, fallen gears and, with a child's natural grace, placed it back into the small tray. She looked at him with her wide, honest eyes, a simple act of putting something back where it belonged. She didn't know the symbolism, the immense weight of her tiny action, but she had seen something broken, and, without judgment, she had simply tried to help him put it back together. It was this small, unscripted gesture that broke through the years of his self-imposed isolation. He looked at the tiny gear, now neatly back in place, and then at Maya, her face an expression of quiet concern. He saw not a child, but a person offering a piece of their strength to someone who had none left. He realized that the first step to healing wasn't to fix the past, but to accept a hand that was offered in the present. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a sound that felt foreign and new. He picked up his tools, his hands steadier now, no longer fighting the ghosts of his past, but acknowledging them. He wasn't just fixing a watch anymore. He was finally beginning to face the truth. He sat for hours, hunched over the workbench, not as a prisoner of his past, but as its final witness. He no longer saw a collection of broken parts, but the pieces of a story he was finally brave enough to tell. The coordinates, the sand, the hidden message, they weren't just clues, they were fragments of his friend's heart. With a newfound resolve, his hands, which had once trembled with guilt, now moved with a quiet, steady purpose. He was no longer trying to fix the unfixable. He was simply honoring a man he loved by putting the last pieces of his legacy in place. For the first time in a decade, Leo was working with something he was a part of, not just a stranger to. With a methodical focus, he put the final gears and springs into their places, the tiny mechanisms clicking into an intricate order. But his mind was on the coordinates, a new truth he had finally dared to face. He had run from them for years, but now he typed them into a map. The location was not a battlefield. It was a secure, predetermined safe house, an alternative extraction point. Marcus had a contingency. He had a plan to save himself, a way out he had kept in his back pocket. But he had never used it. He had stayed with the unit, stayed with Leo, even when his own plan might have guaranteed his survival. The truth wasn't a verdict of Leo's fault. It was a testament to Marcus's profound love. He hadn't been a traitor, a man who broke a promise. He had been a hero who transcended it. Marcus had chosen to stay, to fight alongside his brother, knowing the risks, knowing there was another way out. He had sacrificed his own safe passage to stand by Leo's side. The guilt that had haunted Leo for so long, the crushing weight of a promise he thought he had broken, now shattered into a million pieces. In its place, a fierce, raw gratitude surged through him, a feeling so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. He wasn't a survivor who had failed. He was a survivor who had been saved. The final screw was tightened, the glass face carefully wiped clean. He wound the tiny brass knob, held the watch to his ear, and listened. The first tick was a soft, tentative sound, but the next was stronger, and then another, until it settled into a steady, rhythmic beat. It was the sound of a heartbeat, a life brought back to life. The watch, once a symbol of a moment frozen in time, was now a ticking beacon of hope. It wasn't a finished chapter. It was the first beat of a new one. The watch was ticking. He was finally ticking too. A few days later, Maya came to the shop. She didn't rush him. She simply sat on the stool, her hands clasped in her lap, a quiet patience in her young eyes. She didn't have to say a word. Her trust was a silent hymn. She had brought him something broken, and she was waiting for him to return it whole, a simple act of faith that had unlocked a decade of silence. Her presence was a reflection of the hope that had lived in her father's heart, the hope that had been preserved in a single ticking watch. Leo walked over to her, his hand holding the small, worn pouch. He opened it and carefully took out the watch. It shone, polished and gleaming, the cracks in the glass face a reminder of its journey, not a flaw. He presented it to her, his hand trembling slightly. She reached out and took it, her small fingers brushing against his. In that fleeting moment of contact, a decade of silence, grief, and unspoken words flowed between them. He had given her back a piece of her father's time, but she had given him back his own. But that wasn't all. He walked back to his workbench and opened a small, locked drawer he hadn't touched in years. He pulled out a weathered, sealed envelope. He had held onto it since the day he came home, never having the courage to deliver it. He walked back to Maya and held it out. "This was with him," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "It's for you." She took it, her eyes wide, not with sadness, but with a deep, quiet understanding. It wasn't a hero's letter. It was a father's final words to his little girl, and Leo, in finally handing it over, was delivering the promise he thought he had broken. In her hands, the watch and the letter were not burdens of grief, but anchors of a new beginning. She didn't open the letter. She just held it close, her gaze meeting Leo's. She didn't see the man who had survived, the man who had carried the guilt. She saw the man who had finally brought a piece of her father home. The unspoken forgiveness in her eyes was a balm on a wound that had festered for years. He had finally honored his friend, not by keeping the watch, but by releasing the truth and a letter that had waited for a decade. He was not whole, but he had taken the first step toward mending. The world never saw him. But today, you did. He walked away with nothing but the one thing he thought he had lost forever: hope.